Thanks, Sue. Thanks, everybody. I guess just listening to the conversation from the question time, there's some of the questions may be answered in the presentation. I'd encourage you to ask a few more questions. Just when you thought you'd heard enough acronyms and seen enough charts, I do have a few more, so I apologise for that. But from the questions, I think I probably needed a few more as well. So without being too controversial, Brian, I think your question around peak, when you actually look, this is a chart which shows the summer peak demand for New South Wales over the last 40 or so years. If you looked at the chart for winter peak demand, it's very, very similar. If you look at the chart for energy, it actually is very similar as well. So the challenge that we have, and there's been steady growth for a very, very long period of time, and until quite recently, things were quite stable, which enabled, and Neil talked about forecasting, it enabled us to actually get a fairly good grasp on what we needed to do as the next step and when we needed to time it. So I guess the question is what's really changed? And if you look at the last few years, and this is not the current year, but there's been a whole lot of impacts around impacting electricity supply and peak demand. The GFC, the rising Australian dollar, price increases have had an impact on the way people actually perceive and use the electricity supply. And we've got the solar bonus scheme and hence the reducing PV prices. I guess all the costs of the PV panels themselves have gone down, which has increased the uptake. Energy efficiency, the compact light bulbs, now LED light bulbs, and also people's preferences. I suspect that the challenge with this one is we don't actually have a baseline. It's very, very difficult to understand the magnitude of the impact of all of these things, but we see it at an aggregated level. So I don't know if I addressed the question on when we look at peak. I mean, it's highly variable, but it is very, very similar. It's interesting to note that the latest AEMO figures are suggesting that we've still got I think a 1.1% average annual growth rate over 10 years in peak demand and about 0.4% in energy. Now that is constantly revised and it does change, I understand. But it is difficult to actually anticipate what the number will be. If you asked somebody 5 years ago what they thought the peak demand might be right now, I think you'd get a very different answer. So a little bit more context around peak demand itself. Around demand management itself. It's a term which you'll often hear used interchangeably with network support, demand management, demand response. So, and energy efficiency fits in the mix as well. So demand management is a broad term which covers lots of different things around managing the peak. Energy efficiency, Luke's going to do a presentation on later, so I won't go into much detail on that. But it's about using less energy for the same activity or the same output. There's also broad-based demand management, and typically there's system-wide reductions in demand and things that TransGrid already do around off-peak load control, experimenting with load control of air conditioning and similar programs. What I want to talk about today is really demand response, and that's, I guess, an agreement with customers. So it's a short-term decision to reduce the energy consumption, which actually, and I don't actually have a load duration curve here, which is another really good curve to talk about, another graph for you. But the peak supply is only for a very, very short period of time across the network on a number of instances in the year. So when we talk about demand response, it addresses that short-term peak on a number of occasions. I stole one of the charts that Bruce used earlier. The grey line actually means nothing, so it's not a band, it's just a line. It's just a line in space. In this case, I've not used a forecast number. So the main drivers, we've also done some work with KPMG, as Bruce alluded to. The main drivers for the increase are around population growth and state income. Now, there's a whole mix of factors which I talked about, which make it very, very difficult to understand where the offsets are. So the graph itself, there's similar numbers. So the blue bars are the capacity of the network. While that grey line could have been flat, I've actually shown it increasing because it's still increasing. The numbers that are very interesting to us are what we need to plan for over the next little while. And the truth is we actually don't know what the number is. A little bit of animation there. I get points for that one. So the actual amount of network support we need 4 years out, we actually don't know what that is just yet, because we know what the capacity of the network is, but we don't know what the forecast load will be. We have an idea. It's a range of numbers, so we're actively trying to actually understand that. So the thing about demand response, though, we heard earlier about the incremental steps, the large steps that are required for either a 132 kV cable or a 330 kV cable. Demand response can be incremental. We can do things at a more granular level. So I guess if we can secure the amount that we need, then we've got a good chance of actually addressing some of that constraint. We've got some experience. We've done it in the past. There's been 2 programs significant to TransGrid, 350 megawatts in 2008-9, and the 40 megawatts in the Sydney CPD summer before last. Just to dig down into that second project, the project was participated by a third party. It was actually Ennoc, was an aggregator. They contributed 35 megawatts of load. TransGrid participated as well and contributed 5 megawatts. So it's sort of a high-level description, if you like, of what that project was. So you can see that there was about 80 sites. The average site was about 600 kilowatt hours effective, and there was a mix of participants in that project itself. So the demand response is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a deliberate short-term decision to a specific event. So it involves the customers reducing the consumption or providing generation, or in fact providing a feed-in from storage. Now that's the next thing that people are talking about. To give you an idea, 600 kilowatts, it's about 242.5 kilowatt split air conditioning systems, which is an average size of an air conditioning system. If you're trying to secure 40 megawatts, that's 16,000 air conditioners. There is a challenge with this, and I've stolen another chart. Sorry guys, another chart I've put in there. This work that TransGrid and TransGrid did in about 2009 from a demand management investigation. The challenge is very much dependent on the type of load. So those purple coloured curves are actually the inner metro load curve, and you can see that it peaks mid-afternoon and it tapers off later in the afternoon. So when you're talking about, I just use the analogy about the air conditioners, we can't actually use air conditioning to actually alleviate the load within the Sydney inner metro area, because no matter how many air conditioners you turn off, it's not when the peak's occurring. It's a really, really important point. Some of the challenges. With demand response, there's no guarantee that we can get the right amount. It needs to be the right amount in the right place at the right time. This is some of our experience from the past. There's been about 9 RFPs, requests for proposals, issued to the public. We've received responses to 6 of those. The end result is we've only had 2 go ahead. Now the challenge is, I suppose there's been different reasons that we haven't had sufficient response. Some of them are technical constraints, some of them might be capacity. But there's also another perspective from the third party. I'm sitting on the table with a couple of aggregators. If we go to the market today and expect to flick the switch tomorrow, there are challenges in trying to secure that amount of demand response. So people that participate need some indication of what's required with enough lead time so they can actually make the investments to provide that level of response. So I have heard that feedback from 1 or 2 others participating. What we're proposing for Powering Sydney's Future, there was a question in the audience around what we were thinking about in terms of regulation. So what we've put into our proposal to the Australian Energy Regulator, our regulator, is something that we're calling preemptive network support. So for the period up to before that network support's actually required, which is in 2019, so the dark green bars, we're suggesting that we make an investment now, and we've called that preemptive network support, to actually start to engage with the market through third parties, through directly with customers, to actually secure enough network support so when it is required in 2019, we can actually achieve the target. And as I said, that target's variable. So, Phil, you were talking about the scale on the graphs. That's just an estimation. There's no hard line and bottom number. So, order of magnitude, it's a significant number. When you look at the last project that was 40 megawatts, we're looking at upwards of 150, assuming the same load growth. I suppose another point too is we could probably increase beyond the potential. So if we actually secure more, then there's other ways of utilising that. We talked a little bit about electric vehicles, not a lot. The University of Sydney was commissioned to do a report on electric vehicles. It had some interesting findings. What to do with demand response, you might ask. So the high-level conclusions, and as Bruce said, they're available on the website, but there's between 14 and 39 megawatts of demand might actually occur due to the introduction of electric vehicles by 2035. At the same time, if you talk about vehicle-to-grid applications, between 6 and 44 megawatts, we may actually be able to tap into storage. So while they will have an impact on the network, they can also benefit us, and we might be able to use that from a demand response perspective. I guess our approach now is really around collaboration, market understanding and development, and then also technology trialling. I've already mentioned that the usage patterns are uncertain, so there's a few things that we need to do that we'd like to do, particular activities around better understanding the peak demand profile. So we're doing some research, we're talking to people, we're asking yourselves what your opinion is about this. We want to facilitate the growth of the demand management market. We think that's a really important thing to do. We've asked for some funding through our current proposal to the regulator, and we think that's justified. It pays for itself. There's actually a positive business case. We want to improve the understanding of the larger energy users. So I think, Brian, your point was a lot of people are out there that can actually participate, whether it be through embedded generation. We want to actually explore expanding their understanding and helping them understand how they can participate to the programs. We also want to boost engagement with the broader community around demand management. And I guess our next steps, just in closing, we do intend to issue a request for proposals later this year as we define the problem. And I think that's enough. When you look at the problem occurring in 2019, if we build that potential in the market from now, then we may have a very good chance of actually meeting that target. We'll continue to work with TransGrid around the most optimal portfolio of solutions. As I said earlier, demand management is a broad mix of things, including demand response, the broad-based programs, and energy efficiency, which I think Luke's going to talk about shortly. And we also want to open up a conversation on demand management itself, and we'll facilitate another targeted workshop about some of the solutions that we're proposing and how we might go about that. So I think that's it from me. Thanks.